Muted. Sorry to everyone online. It's unmuted now. We're looking at Timothy and Titus. So these books, again, are often called pastoral books because of this misunderstanding. Often the term pastor is applied to a minister or a preacher. That is not what the term pastor means. The term pastor, like the term overseer and elder, applies to those who have the task of shepherding, of overseeing, those who have the responsibility of being stewards over God's people. And we see those people described both in 1 Timothy and in the book of Titus. Today we often use the term elder, although pastor or bishop are all also terms used biblically for this single office, this single person, not person, but this single administrative title, if you will, for the Lord's church. And they are those individuals, always spoken of in a plurality, that is at least two or more, who take the governance of the church, not to establish their own ways, but again, to help build and establish and protect God's plans for his church. Even as we see, again, in those books of the book of Revelation and those letters to the churches, too often those churches had gone astray. And again, we see some of those churches even mentioned in the book of Acts and among Paul's missionary journeys as ones that he helped to establish, and even ones that he may have gone back to, as was his standard practice, was to establish a congregation and then to return to it sometime later and ensure that it had an eldership, to ensure that it had that leadership in place that was so beneficial and also necessary for the church's health and well-being. And so it's in that way that we can still call these pastoral books, because they give us the qualifications for those that are pastors, not ministers, not preachers, but as we call them so often in the church, elders. And so they are in that way, but it's not really the point of the book. The point of the book is to tell these two men, these young preachers, how it is that they are to instruct the church. And I think that's also important, is that Paul's concern is not entirely about these men. He doesn't in any way, shape, or form give a qualification, for example, for a preacher. He does say that they have responsibilities, but there's not a qualification like we see for elders. And it's not necessarily entirely about these men and their character and their conduct, but it's often about what they teach and how they encourage the congregation to behave. Think of it that way. For example, Paul goes on for long sections telling Timothy and Titus both to instruct various people in the church, young men, young women, older women, how to behave and how they should conduct themselves. Well, why is that important? Because the church itself as a whole has responsibilities. The church has a duty to God, not just as individual members, but as a group, as a congregation. And the church has to effectively work in that regard in order to do what God wants us to do. And we'll also see in these books some of what it is that the church is supposed to do. Because it is, of course, important that we understand that both as individuals and as a group, we also have tasks. We have responsibilities. We have things that God has called us to be active in and to perform on his behalf. As Paul tells the church in Thessalonica, he says that we have been entrusted with the gospel. We have been given God's trust in preaching, in teaching, in conducting, in living and demonstrating the gospel of Christ. And these books tell us a lot of how we do that, not just as individuals, but especially how we do that as a body. And so we're going to look through these books, not necessarily in extensive detail. I don't want to go too long and belabor them too much. They're relatively short books. 1 Timothy is the longest, but even it in your Bible is probably only 4 or 5 pages. And so, again, they're not, extensive tomes. They're certainly not as lengthy as the book of Revelation, nor are they as difficult to understand. The difficulty in these books comes in the application. These books are challenging to us if we give them the attention and the respect that they deserve, because they should call us to do probably more than we are doing currently. So as we look at this, as we begin, we're going to begin, of course, with the book of 1 Timothy. And we'll start with some background information. Timothy is introduced to us in the book of Acts as Paul goes to the cities of Lystra and Derbe and others. He encounters this young man, Timothy. In the book of Acts, it says that he is well spoken of by all of the brethren. Timothy has an interesting background and one that is undoubtedly one of the things that drew Paul to him, because of course there were a lot of faithful brethren, and we see that Paul traveled with a number of individuals, but Timothy's background and his personal history would certainly set him apart from so many others. That is, Timothy, even as his name betrays, has a Greek background. The name Timothy is not Hebrew. But his mother was Jewish. And so Timothy comes from this kind of dual life, if you will. He has a Jewish background, and so he can very easily understand and apply himself to the teaching and the interactions with those of a Jewish background. But given the fact that he also has a Greek background, as his father was not Jewish, he also understands that mentality. And again, his name, Timothy, even is not Jewish, and kind of shows that there is a relatively solid influence of that Greek background. In the book of Acts, we see that Paul brings this young man along on his missionary journeys into Europe, helping broaden this man's horizons, yes, but also helping Paul and him to develop a relationship, so much so that in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 2, Paul calls him his true child in the faith. Now, Paul, as we understand it from a biblical standpoint, was unmarried and did not appear to have children of his own. And so this relationship between Paul and Timothy was very, very close. Again, forged in this combination of growth and struggle, triumph, and laboring together in the mission fields and other places, so much so that Paul considers himself a father figure, and undoubtedly, likewise, Timothy considers Paul a father figure. But again, they have this very close relationship. Not much is said about Timothy's parents as far as their faith is concerned when it comes to whether or not they themselves were Christians. And I don't believe that Paul makes this statement as some sort of, I'm going to replace your father who didn't believe, or anything like that. So, let's not read too much into this. I believe that really it just speaks, even as I spoke a couple weeks ago about the relationships that we can have in the church, right? And how we are called to be mothers and fathers to to brothers and sisters in Christ, these two just developed a very close bond that even went beyond, what we today might call mentoring and into this realm of closeness of father and son. Now, that's important that we understand this because of the way that Paul writes in this book. And I would say all three of these books, both of those to Timothy and the book to Titus, Paul isn't always what I would call diplomatic in his writing. That is, very often Paul is blunt. He definitely does not pull punches when it comes to doctrinal matters and things of that nature. And yet he is very careful when you read his other letters, when you read letters to congregations especially. He makes sure to phrase things and frame things in very distinct ways, where the nature, the voice, the way that he writes these letters to Timothy and Titus are very different, largely because of their relationship. He takes a very fatherly tone, and sometimes that is blunt. Not harsh, but certainly much less apologetic, if you will, than what we might see in some of his other letters. Because they have this relationship, there are times that Paul just calls them out. Just flat out, you're doing wrong, or you're not doing right. There's a distinction there, by the way. We often only think that there's the one or the other, but you can not be doing wrong and still not be doing right. And Paul will occasionally call out these young men for these types of things. And at the same time, because he has this relationship and because they've both traveled with Paul, they have both taught alongside of him, he doesn't have to go into a lot of background about some of the things that he brings up because they already know them, right? So a lot of this is so that they can just be reminded of these things. For example, I have no doubt in my mind that Timothy and Titus both already knew the qualifications for elders, because they had worked with Paul. They had seen Paul not only preach and teach these things, but also then use those qualifications to find worthy men in these congregations to take that very role. And as well as many of the other things that he talks about in these books, this is not new information. It's a repetition of things they already knew, but it's things that Paul wants to emphasize because maybe, as I said, there are areas that Timothy and Titus seem to be struggling with, whether in their application or their boldness to teach and preach these things. For some reason, Paul felt the need to bring them up. But that being said, Paul doesn't give a lot of explanation to his statements. He doesn't build, for example, as we're looking at the book of Romans right now in our Sunday morning sermons, he doesn't really build his arguments. He just lays it out there. Whereas we look at the book of Romans, or as we looked at fairly recently the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul kind of builds to a point. Here he just lays it out. And again, this is because, kind of like the book of Revelation, he's writing to experienced Christians. He's writing to people who already know. And so he can just lay it out there and say, do this, with an expectation that they will do this. When it comes to Timothy specifically, Paul, again, in that relationship that they have, assigns him, urges him. Again, I don't believe that the way that this kind of progressed, I don't believe it to be some sort of like Paul was handpicking, okay, you're going to go over here and you're going to go over here. It's not the way that I think that the early church worked as far as the apostles assigning ministers or preachers to different places. But we do see here that in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 3 that Paul urged Timothy to remain at Ephesus. Now, when we go back to the book of Acts, we can see that Paul spent an extended amount of time in and around the city of Ephesus, 3 years. Actually, the longest time in any mention of the missionary journeys that Paul stayed in one place or region. And so Paul had a lot of investment, a lot of work put into that time or into that area, into those congregations. And he trusted Timothy, as Paul was continuing some of his missionary journeys, he trusted Timothy to remain there and take up this task, to do his job, and to assist these brethren in continuing in the pathway that Paul had laid for them, the path that Jesus himself trod and showed to us, right? And so again, this is very telling of the relationship, especially between Paul and Timothy. Ephesus was very personal for Paul, and he trusted Timothy. We can also see this, for example, when in the book to the Philippians, Paul mentions there that Timothy was the only person who had the same heart as his, specifically when it came to his concern and care for the church. And again, so these kind of things and these statements that are made by Paul about Timothy, or things that we can see in the book of Acts and other places, kind of all inform us about why it is that Paul wrote these two letters to this young man, and then also similarly to Titus, who also is called Paul's son in the faith, although the relationship and the bond just may not be quite as close, not quite as strong as that between Paul and Timothy. So when we look at these things, there's really not any solid argumentation about these books when it comes to denying, for example, what chapter 1 and verse 1 says, that it was written by Paul to Timothy or to Titus. There have been some that have argued, again, because they do not understand how Christianity actually worked. Some have made the argument that the things that Paul speaks of, especially in regards to the organization of the church and all of these things, they make a claim that this was far too advanced for the time in which they were written. But remember, the gospel, the church didn't evolve. It was given, proclaimed from the very beginning, from the day of Pentecost in the book of Acts. The church was the church. Now, it took some time for maybe problem areas to kind of present themselves. And so we have, for example, Paul and Peter and John's letters of correction. But that doesn't mean that all of these things, like an eldership and all of these types of things, were later additions that kind of evolved. They were always the plan, always the pattern. But sometimes, even as when you're doing, for example, construction or something of that nature, it takes time for maybe some of the weak points, not in the design, but in the workmanship, if you will, to show themselves, right? What I mean by that is we're human, right? The church is made of human beings who take a perfect plan and implement it often in imperfect ways, right? For example, if you're having a house built and you have an engineer and you have an architect build the plans, make everything right, but then the builder that you hire uses subpar materials, warped studs, too thin of drywall, right? Not enough insulation. You can't blame the architect or the engineer, right? They laid out a plan that would work if implemented. Where did the problem come in? The implementation. right? God lays out a plan, a pattern for us, both as individuals and as a congregation. And just because we often fail him in implementing that plan doesn't mean that the problem is with the plan. Which is why so often the letters that Paul and Peter and John and others write deal with that idea of fixing ourselves, because then that's going to help fix the church. And the same thing applies here, but as we look at this, we're going to see, I think, with a little better clarity, just how perfect God's plan is. And again, a failure on our part or anyone else's to follow the pattern doesn't lay blame upon God, it lays blame upon us. Even in the book, even as we look at the book of Revelation again in chapters 2 and 3, God was not at fault because those churches lost their first love or started to accept false doctrine, or because they became arrogant, or because they, again, failed God in any number of ways. God didn't fail. They were failing, right? And so the same thing applies here in the letters to Timothy and Titus. And so, like I said, that's really the only argument that's ever been raised about Paul's authorship, is really by those who don't truly understand the way that the church worked and the way that Revelation worked, right? Just because these things, even the gospel accounts, were written an estimated 20 plus years after the events themselves took place, that does not mean that people didn't know about them, right? It doesn't mean that it was all of a sudden now, only once it was written down, understood and accepted, right? Especially in the region of the world in which the Bible takes place, and especially in the time frame, the idea of oral histories and the idea of preaching and teaching these things, both from study but also especially from inspiration, there wasn't exactly a strong need for it to be written down. Remember, we're used to things today where everybody has their own copy, right? And while I appreciate the idea of so many people, so often how we often tell people, okay, I'm going to be reading from this passage if you want to open your Bible and follow along, I also want us to realize that that is probably less than about a 300-year, and I would say even probably less than that, even a possibility of that even happening. Realistically, it's probably closer to only in the last 100 to 150 years that would be possible to say that with confidence. Because even after the making of the printing press, books were still extremely expensive. Okay? And so your average person still would not have had necessarily a copy of a Bible for themselves. Now, and this is also where we often see the idea of like a family Bible, right? Where not every single member of the family even had their own. But again, these things were taught, and why there's such an emphasis here for Timothy and Titus to hold to the sound doctrine and to preach things, is because people were very reliant upon hearing these things proclaimed. They didn't have the written word. And even if the congregation did have these various writings, they had a copy of Mark and Matthew and Luke and John, and they had some copies of other letters, members weren't taking those home. Access to the text itself wasn't limited because people were trying to hide it, but it was limited because you may only have one copy for an entire congregation.
And the concept of
Mm-hmm.
The creation of the world is a little bit advanced for mortal men. Also, there is nothing more advanced than the living God.
Mm-hmm.
And he works through men to accomplish what he wants, his will. So, the fact that, these concepts for the church are too advanced is a ridiculous argument by people that don't understand who God is and what he can accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also significant that these challenges that I'm mentioning were only really very recently raised, primarily in the early 1800s, during the time when everything was questioned, right? When in the Great Awakening, so to speak, and in an era where, due to an acceptance of science, people began to just, question everything, especially if it was related to the church. And that doesn't mean that some of the things that were questioned, I think, were valid, but that doesn't mean everything that was questioned was valid, right? And so again, the fact that for the majority of New Testament history, there was no question, there was no doubt, there was no dissension in the authorship of these letters as being validly from Paul, I have no problem with it either, right? I only mention it because, again, it is out there. You may run into it if you do some study on your own, if you do some reading. There are some of those things, and of course, there is especially given some of the things written in these letters, especially, but in other things of Paul, other areas of Paul's writing in regards to the relationship between men and women. There are a number of people who seek to discredit Paul pretty much wholesale because of that. But again, that's not a problem with the pattern. That's a problem with the builder, right? Another very interesting thing about these books, being how short they are, there are 175 words used in these three books that are found nowhere else in the New Testament. We know that Paul was a very learned man, right? We know that he sat at the feet of Gamaliel. We know that he was, as he calls himself, a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was extremely knowledgeable, and Paul's vocabulary and his literary uses throughout the New Testament are very vast and wide. But again, because of the nature of these books, and some people have even challenged that, well, why is Paul using all of this crazy language? Well, because again, these are men he has long-term, deep relationships with. Right? I would imagine that you probably speak to your spouse, or you probably speak maybe even to your children differently than you speak with and to the checker at the grocery store or the teller at the bank, right? You probably have much deeper conversations. You probably discuss a lot wider variety of topics, right? And so you develop to some extent a vocabulary of your own, right? Well, wouldn't it make sense then, when Paul is writing to men, that not only does he know him, but have spent a lot of time with him, that he could broaden some of his vocabulary, and he could use some terms, and he could use he could address some topics that would be not what he's going to address the general public with, so to speak. Doesn't that make sense? It does to me, but again, it is a kind of an interesting thing, and it is a time, it is an interesting thing that Paul does expand his vocabulary that broadly in relatively short books. But I think that's more of just an interesting thing that Paul was very trusting of these men to understand him because of their history and their relationship. I think that says more about that than it does anything else. That being said, there is also a mention in these books, and this is again part of our understanding of inspiration and part of our understanding of the actual physical authorship of these things. There's mention in these books to Luke possibly serving as a secretary for Paul. We do know that Paul has mentioned in other places that he had a thorn in the flesh. There are mentions in some of Paul's letters to having to write in very large letters. Some commentators believe that maybe part of what afflicted Paul, especially later in his life, was some sort of vision problem. And again, even if Paul dictated to Luke, who was the actual hand that put pen to paper, does not take away from the fact that this would be inspired by God, given word for word to Paul, who then gave it word to word to Timothy, who then word for word wrote it down on the page. Okay? We shouldn't take that to have any way affected the message or the reliability of these texts. But rather, again, it's just showing us that, again, God can use whomever and however he chooses to put his message out there. And again, Luke was already an inspired writer, having written both the gospel account that bears his name and the book of Acts. And so he's already traveled that path, right? And again, I'm just referencing these things because, again, it is important for us to have a background. It is important for us to have a foundation, but it's also important for us to understand where people have attempted to discredit these texts. Because, again, if we're talking about texts here that, to a large extent, help us to understand the structure and the importance of that structure for the church, we need to have an answer for those objections. Otherwise, we might be building upon shaky ground, right? And I want to make sure that we understand that by following the things that Paul speaks of in these books, we are in no way, shape, or form building on shaky ground. But we are fully and completely building upon the rock, the promises, the foundation that God himself gave to us. All right, we have a couple minutes. Are there any questions or comments about the books? We're not going to really dive into the text this morning. I just, again, wanted to kind of do an introduction not only to the class but to the books, so you'd understand how we're going to be progressing. Again, I may not hit every single verse because it's really going to be about what is Paul trying to tell Timothy or Titus to tell to the church on how we are to behave and how we are to uphold this institution we call the church.
The impression throughout the years that Ephesus was a training center for basic Christianity, but also those that are going to be sent out to other areas.
Yes, Ephesus was an extremely important. Ephesus and I would say the region of Asia Minor were extremely important to the growth of the church, especially in the late first century and into the second century. Biblically, we can see three major hubs, if you will, for Christianity in the Bible itself. The first, of course, being Jerusalem, where the church began. The second being Antioch of Syria, which is where Paul not only departed from, but returned to on all of his missionary journeys, save for the last one, where he went directly to Jerusalem there. And then it shifts later to Ephesus. And again, part of that was not because of Paul, but because, like Antioch, for example, the church there embraced this role, right? Antioch embraced this role of spreading the gospel, of accepting people from various backgrounds. For example, in the book of Acts, the church at Antioch in Syria has as many as 6 different men preaching the gospel in that one congregation. And so, again, it became this very large, vibrant community of people. And one of the reasons that they were able, for example, to send a man like Paul out away from themselves for sometimes 10 plus years and not, be hurt by it is because they had such a large community. And yes, it would appear Ephesus kind of then took over that role. Again, the church didn't spread exclusively to the west, but if we're to look at a map of the world, from Israel, there's a whole lot more people that live to the west than there are to the east, at least before you start running into major major physical barriers like deserts and extremely tall mountains, right? For example, if you're to go by foot from Israel to, say, to what we call Asia today, whether that be Southern Asia or even India, you're going to have to cross multiple deserts, and to get to China, you're going to have to cross the Himalayas. Not an easy task on foot, right? And so, again, there's not as many boundaries. Yes, there are the Alps, but there's also the Mediterranean to get around the Alps, right? And so we see the spread of Christianity going north and west much more heavily than we do to the east, although we do know that it did. For example, in Acts chapter 2, there's reference to people living in what would at that time be known as mainly Persia and those areas. So it's not as though people weren't there. And it's not as though Christianity was unknown there, but the spread to the west especially is important. And so, again, we would expect, a church like Ephesus, which is right there on that border between Asia and Europe, to become very important, and it did. The Church of Ephesus figures very prominently in the New Testament for that reason, because not only geographically it became important, but also because the church there, by and large, really stepped forward to do some things that were needed to be done. Much of the same way that we see, for example, today we have congregations that have, a large community and take on the role of training missionaries or training preachers, or take on these other roles of doing other things, right? Some of these other organizations, and they take on some of these large tasks because, again, because they have the people power, so to speak, right? Any other questions or comments?
I like your analogy of the contractor and the architect and engineer. Having spent 30 years as a contractor, it was very important that we had communication weekly between the architect and the engineer. Just for that reason. There was a misunderstanding of what the drawing said, or what was said in the letter or whatever. Face to face, you worked out those problems.
Mm-hmm.
That was something we insisted as a contractor.
Absolutely. All right, we will pause there, and Lord willing, next week we will pick up by actually digging into the text of 1 Timothy. Thank you very much.